I was dead. I know that sounds strange. I guess it's an oxymoron. You have to be sentient to know anything. And if you're dead, you are not sentient. In other words, if I was dead, how could I be aware of that? I was having an espresso at Café of Brasilia, the oldest, most famous cafe in Lisbon, with wooden booths, mirrored walls, and a long oak panel bar straight out of the 18th century. It is located in Rocio, in the Chiado district. What was really strange is how much I was enjoying looking at the local girls, particularly Maria of Cell, who was walking towards me with a question in her eyes. As she approached, I started to ask her if the excitement I felt as I admired her quite charming young body was appropriate for a dead man. I wisely chose not to say anything as she asked, "Do you want outra? Are you coming over for dinner tonight?" I said yes, and, of course. I guess I should back up a little. Before I died, I was known as Dave Lawrence, loving husband of Maria, living in Colorado. When I died, now I am William Billy Sanderson, expatriate Yank from Colorado, living in a comfortable apartment in Lisbon in the Barro Alto on Rua de Norte. I had met Maria about 6 months ago here at the cafe. She was 28 at the time. Her aunt owned the place, and she helped out sometimes. She was an anomaly for a girl from Portugal. She was tall, a little over 5'10". She wasn't slim, maybe willowy is better. She weighed about 120 pounds with gentle flowing curves rather than ostentatious ones, long legs that won't quit. If you've seen Daniela Hantakova, 5'11", 123 pounds, you know what I mean. She had, I guessed at the time, 34B breasts that seemed to have an attitude. Her long legs flowed up into the most hauntingly beautiful as I had ever seen. She had kind of dirty blonde hair and fair regular features with an upturned button nose. She was light-skinned with brilliant powder blue eyes with a few freckles around them. Later, I was to find she had freckles elsewhere. In other words, if you spent some time in Lisbon looking at the local girls and saw her walking toward you, she would stand out. Maria was born on the island of Terceira in the Azores. Her father was an American tech surgeon in the weather office of the 65th Air Base Wing at Lajes Field. Her mother was a local girl and worked in the base library. They met, and well, things happened. Marriage and Maria followed in short order. The family moved around the world with her dad's duty assignments until he was killed in a car crash. At the time, he was stationed at Pope Air Force Base, and Maria was a junior majoring in marketing with a minor in literature at Duke University. After her dad died, her mom moved to Lisbon to work with her sister at the cafe while Maria finished her studies. After graduating, she joined her mom in Lisbon, working part-time at the cafe and part-time with a friend, putting together a small agency for writers of romance novels, pulp fiction, working particularly on translations to and from various languages. After a year, she met and married a football player, a right half who played for Sporting Lisbon. After they had a daughter, Katrina, his contract was purchased by Manchester City. Maria and the baby were to follow when he got settled, but he met a dancer. In short, he called her and said, "Don't come." Maria was pretty broken up about this, but after a year, she realized that her ex was just a happy jock who would still be a kid when he died. The agency did better than they expected and had signed up a number of writers from the US, Spain, and Portugal, with a couple from France and Ireland. That brought me back to being dead and admiring Maria. She stopped by a couple of times that evening to chat, and when she finished, I walked her home. Like I said, I had known her for about 6 months. I probably would not have gotten anywhere with her until once, over coffee, she talked about needing writers for English. She needed translators, and was looking for new writers also. I was fluent in Spanish, and started translating romance stories from the US and England into Spanish. I told her that I had always wanted to write, and thought it might be fun. I showed her the short stories, and the one novel I had been working on. So it started. I began with the translations, and then threw in a few romance novels of my own. Through all of this, I started spending more time with Maria and Katrina. As we walked a few blocks to her apartment, she put her arm in mine, and we chatted and looked in the bakery windows for dessert. I was starting to feel pretty good until we stopped by her mom's to pick up Katrina, who was 4 at this time. As we started climbing the stairs, the door opened, and this whirling dervish came flying through the air screaming, "Billy! Billy!" I hadn't been intimate with Maria, but it seemed we were getting close. She was lonely, but she was also very protective of her daughter. I fell in love with Katrina the moment I saw her. In my other life, we had never had kids. Maybe if we had. Anyway, I really liked Katrina, and she kind of took possession of me. One of the reasons I hadn't gotten further with Maria was because her daughter always seemed to be between us. I grabbed Katrina as I tried to keep from falling down the stairs and started tickling her. She squiggled out of my arms, giggling, and ran up the stairs to her grandma Fia. We chatted for a little, and then went to Maria's apartment. Maria asked, "Could you give Katrina her English lesson while I fix dinner? We are having bacalhau brace with a nice vino verde with it." I had been working with Katrina for about 2 months with children's books in English. She loved the stories, and most nights when I was there, I would make up a story for her after her mom put her to bed. She would fight to stay awake, but always fall asleep after about 5 minutes. I think this was Maria's secret plan in having me help with her English. While we were eating the cod and enjoying the green wine, Maria looked at me seriously for a minute and said, "We need to talk after Katrina goes to sleep." I thought, oh God, what did I do now? I finished the meal with some trepidation, but no idea what she wanted to talk about. We sat around drinking coffee and enjoying a very nice vintage tawny port for a while as Katrina played with her toys. Maria got her daughter ready for bed and started cleaning up the kitchen while I told Katrina her story. I was sitting on the sofa, sipping another small port, when Maria came in. "Can I sit down with you?" she quietly asked. I opened my arms, and she slipped into them as she sat on my lap. Not knowing what was going on, I sat there without moving, with my arms around her. After a minute, I could see her shoulders gently shaking. I lifted up her chin and stared into her eyes. She was crying. "Maria, what's wrong?" I asked. She started sobbing. I just helplessly held her and waited for her to calm down. After a bit, she looked up and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her blouse. She looked at me for a minute quietly, and then buried her face in my shoulder. With a muffled voice, she whispered, "Billy, I know you care for me, and the way you are with Katrina has been priceless for me. No, don't say anything yet. I'm lonely," she whispered. "I want you. I want to be with you. Neither of us has said anything, but I think God wants us to be together. You are the answer to my prayers for myself and Katrina." Maria. "No, wait, let me finish. I'm so happy with you, but I haven't been honest with you." She started sobbing again. After a bit, she continued, "I've told you about Paulo, my ex-husband. Billy, I'm Catholic, you know that. I can't get a divorce, and I can't marry you." She slid to the floor, and her body just shook with her crying. Stunned, I sat there for a minute. Marriage. I hadn't said anything about that. I mean, Christ, I'm dead. I can't marry anyone. After a while, Maria quieted down and fell into a restless sleep. Looking at her, I didn't know what to do. Finally, I picked her up and carried her into her bedroom and laid her down. I dampened a washcloth and gently bathed her face. She twisted restlessly, but didn't wake up. I didn't know what to do. Finally, I realized I would have to put her to bed. I got a gown from her dresser and gently took her clothes off. Then I did the hardest thing I had ever done in either of my lives. I put her gown on, careful not to awaken her. I covered her up, and not wanting to leave her alone like that, I lay on top of the sheet next to her. It took me a while to get to sleep, and I started replaying what had happened. I had not really thought about the problems of marriage. Her problem was easy. That's just religion. Mine, Geez, I have a wife in jail probably for life. If I were to try for a divorce, then obviously I wouldn't be dead anymore. If I loved a woman enough to marry her, how could I live a lie and be a bigamist? Life sure is complicated when you're dead. I woke in the first faint light of dawn to see Maria sitting in bed staring at me. Blushing violently, she asked, "Billy, how did I get in bed with my gown on?" I looked at her for a minute. She was softly lovely in the early morning light. "Maria, you fell asleep on the floor. I carried you in and laid you on the bed. I was going to go to my apartment, but I couldn't leave you like that. I put your gown on and covered you up. I lay down because I just didn't know what else to do." Damned if I was going to tell her there were 5 minutes between undressing her and putting her gown on. She seemed to blush even more. I swear I could see the freckles multiplying through the thin gauze of her gown. Embarrassed, she lay beside me and hid her face in my shoulder again. Christ, this was getting to be a habit. Not that I minded, of course. After a few minutes, maybe 10, I put my arm around her and pulled her tight. "Maria, it's my turn to talk. Just hush for a bit and let me talk now." I turned her head and gently brushed my lips against hers. Startled, I pulled back and had an epiphany. Jesus God, I did love her. With all my being, I did love her. Maria lay there looking up at me with a curious smile on her face. I kissed that lovely little smile. She lay not moving with her eyes closed. She gasped, oh Billy, God, I've been so lonely. Love me, make love to me, even if it's just for now." We made love. I lay still and realized she was crying again, but as she looked up, I saw it was a cry for happiness. "Billy, I don't care what happens. I love you. I just want to live with you. Love you. I need you. Katrina needs you. Love me now, please." We loved one another until we heard Katrina moving in her room. Looking at me, she said, "Billy, we have to talk." But this time, she had a smile on her face. We had our talk, and a few weeks later, I moved in with her. After a time, I became a Portuguese citizen and adopted Katrina. I started working with her and her partner in her agency. I stopped doing translations and focused on writing romance novels, and was almost too successful. I used a nom de plume, a name you would well recognize, a woman's name. After a couple of years, we bought a nice apartment in Cascais, 4 or 5 blocks from the sea. We never again mentioned marriage, but frequently talked of our love. I was happy as never before. My time of darkness, my time of death, was over. I was alive. The end? Not quite. Oh yeah, I bet you are wondering how I died. It seems a lifetime ago. Some of the details I've forgotten. Some of the rage has left. Some I no longer think much about. Maria may or may not still be in prison. I don't really give a damn. It wouldn't bother me if she were released. It wouldn't bother me if she rotted in jail. I've never cared enough to find out. I'm happy as long as the witch stays out of my life. What I remember most is the white-hot anger that overwhelmed me when I saw the email messages. I wasn't looking for them. I wasn't concerned about anything. I had a happy marriage. Somehow, I got a virus on the PC and had to reinstall some of the applications. The biggest problem seemed to be the email system. Before I uninstalled it, I copied the email archive file to a zip disk and then reinstalled the email software. In doing this, I, of course, wiped out any existing passwords, so it was left with the blank default password. I made a mental note to let Maria know what I'd done. I installed the software and reloaded the email archive. I decided I'd better check and make sure everything was working. Everything else seemed to be okay now, so it seemed this would fix the problem. My email came up okay. Great so far. I pondered for a minute and decided I'd better check Maria's email also. She gets real cranky when the computer doesn't work right. The way the blank password works is that you have to change it before you can use the software for the first time. I figured I'd just reinstall the software again after I checked everything out. Otherwise, she would be angry at me. So I entered a password and opened her email, and I started dying. The headers were certainly catchy. The dialogue between this jerk Andrew and Maria was hot. The pictures were even hotter. Hottest of all was my anger. A burning, vicious, killing anger. I couldn't breathe for a minute. I ran into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face and heaved, trying to breathe. Suddenly, I ran into the toilet area and really heaved. I felt like my guts were coming out. I went into my office and poured a small glass of bourbon and gulped it down, then a bigger one, then another one. I finally calmed down. I stopped drinking. I started breathing. I started thinking. My anger had coalesced into a tight, hard ball where my heart used to be. It felt like a cancer eating away, destroying me from the inside. It took years and a beautiful 4-year-old girl before this cancer in my heart started to dissolve. Christ, I hated her. Christ, I hated him. I focused on my hate. Let that keep me going. I resolved. I was smart. I had a good imagination. My dad had always told me that when bad times come, and they will, he said, don't give in to your weaknesses and stand on your strengths. I never asked him what had happened to him that he felt he had to tell me this over and over, but by God, I listened, and I heard him, and I remembered. My strength is my writing. I write novels. Sometimes I write crime novels, and slash or detective, and slash or murder, but always a mystery. I was successful. I was well known. I researched. I talked to cops. I talked to cons. I talked to judges, reporters, and victims. I knew a lot of people. I met a guy at the Colorado Territorial Prison in Cannon City a few years ago. I did him some favors, cigarettes, helping his son out of a jam, etc., for taking the time to talk with me, helping me to solve a plot problem. A few years later, he was released. I helped him get a job. I did him a few more favors. I occasionally paid him for research. He walked the walk. He talked the talk. He added veracity to my stories. He added money to my bank account. Now, in my time of need, real need, I remembered Glenn. I drove down to see him, picked up a couple of cases of cold brews on the way, and said, Glenn, I need to die. Actually, I need to have my wife and her buddy caught and sent to jail. I saw the photos. I told him the whole story and asked him for help. We treated it like a new idea for a novel, and someday I might write it under a different name, of course. I laid out a storyboard. We covered all the details. Anyone watching us would think we were plotting to rob Fort Knox. So this is what we did. We planned everything to happen when she went on her next seminar. I went back to Evergreen, a fantastically beautiful place in the foothills west of Denver. I became the most loving husband. Maria was puzzled at times, but I just loved her and kept on with my writing. The sex got a little rougher. Instead of complaining, she seemed to enjoy it more. She was happier every day, and I died a little each day. She became a piece of meat to me. I used her, but then she had been using me for years. I told her about the computer problem, of how I reinstalled the software, and it would have a blank password. I made sure she knew she would have to enter a password before she could check her email. The lying cheater. Meanwhile, I got smart. She was changing her password regularly, but all I had to do was copy her email archive file to my laptop and fire it up. I tracked her email every day. Andrew sent her a message asking if I ever noticed anything. She replied no. If anything, he is even more loving. God, what an idiot he is. Andrew sent back, yeah, but heck, my idiot, I do love him. But I also love to have sex with you. He is so caught up in his writing that the only way he would notice anything is if he wrote it himself. Idiot. My anger built up. One of my favorite cliches is, he who laughs last, laughs best. 3 months later, it was time for her next seminar, this time in San Antonio. She was going for the usual 5 days. She was also going to hell for eternity, but she didn't know that yet. Yeah, I know you think I'm a vindictive sop. Damn straight. Was I weeping? You think I'll weep? No, I'll not weep. I have full cause of weeping, but this heart shall break into 100,000 pieces or I'll weep. Hell no, I wasn't weeping. It's time to die. All the planning Glenn and I had done broke into three main parts that had to merge together perfectly. How to kill me, how to get me reborn, how to send the sinners to hell. Everything was in place now. It was time to act. The first problem was money. I had to leave totally transparently. I couldn't take anything with me except the clothes I would have on. I had a commission check I'd been holding on to. As soon as Maria left, I went to the bank and deposited the check, a little over 20 grand. I kept out about $2,500. Typical for ongoing expenses. This would get me started. Most of that money could disappear with me. It wasn't near what I needed, though. Maria had some heirloom jewelry she had inherited from her grandmother. I don't know the current value, but when we had them assessed for insurance several years ago, they came out at spot on $250,000. They were too valuable to keep in the house and too old-fashioned for darling Maria to wear, so we kept them in a large safety deposit box at the bank. They were kept in a lockbox within the safety deposit box. Both keys were kept in our safe at home. While she was still on her previous infamous trip, I went to the bank and took the jewelry out and left a large envelope filled with last year's tax papers in the front of the box. I gave the jewelry to Glenn to dispose of. He got just under 100 grand for it. I gave him 10 grand for his health and hoped the rest would last me long enough for the expenses involved with my death and enough to live on for a year or so. I kept out a beautiful emerald brooch worth around 5 grand. I would use this later. A couple of days after Maria got back from San Antonio, I caught her just as she was leaving for work. Babe, could you do me a favor? I have an envelope with tax papers in the bank vault that I need. Could you run over during lunch and pick it up for me? Sure, honey. Could you grab the key for me? It's right here. I got it out of the safe while you were taking your shower. Thanks, darling. I'll give you a back rub tonight to thank you. Oh, I can hardly wait. Will you wait hard? She laughed. Without the key to the lockbox, she wouldn't be able to look at the jewelry. Not that she would have any reason to view it. The last time the lockbox had been opened was when we had all the pieces appraised. Now she was on record as the last one to use the safety deposit box. The tax papers I left in my file cabinet at home, ready for anyone who cared to look, if she even remembered picking them up. Next, I needed documentation. I knew this was going to be expensive. Glenn had another friend. This guy had worked in the documentation section of the CIA for over 30 years. He was essentially paid to forge documents. Everything an agent would need to get into a foreign country. I didn't need that much. I talked it over with Glenn, and we figured on a passport, well-used driver's license, car insurance card with insurance in force if anyone asked, international driver's license, Visa and Amex cards, bank letter of credit. You get the picture. This was going to cost me $10,000 if I could wait 6 months, or for $20,000, I could get them in 6 weeks. I could not wait 6 months. I had letters from my new agent about a romance novel done under my new name. I had a manuscript almost ready for editing. We started the messy business of killing me. First, we needed blood. Glenn knew a guy that had worked in the infirmary at the state prison. We met in a back room of a bar in Trinidad, south of Denver, almost to the New Mexico line. He took about a dozen vials of my blood and put them in a cooler with ice. I put some blood in the trunk of her car and then did a half-assed job of trying to clean it up. I put a couple of drops of blood in the corner of the trunk along with some fuzz from a burlap bag. I stuck a couple of hairs from my head on the blood while it was still moist. I also put blood on the laundry room throw rug leading to the garage. This I half-assed cleaned up. I added a few drops underneath the rear bumper of the car. Glenn got a shovel from Andrew's shed and left it in my shed. Again, I put some blood on it and did a little better job of cleaning it off. but not perfect. In the middle of the night, Glenn picked the lock at Andrew's apartment, and we went in. I got some hairs from Andrew's brush to put in my brush at home, and a couple to put under the pillow in our master bedroom. I carefully got an empty beer can from his trash to put in our kitchen trash. I got lucky and found a tied-off condom in the wastebasket in his bathroom. That got thrown behind our toilet bowl in our bath. It would take a good cleaning to spot it for a good search. Finally, I took the emerald brooch and, wrapping it in one of his handkerchiefs, put it in the bottom drawer of his armoire beneath some of his sweaters. Glenn had gotten a cell phone in Andrew's name, and I used that to call her hotel. I knew he was not taking his car, because Maria's company always provided limo service for the airport. I took and later replaced the key to his locker at Cherry Creek Country Club, where he belonged. I went to the club for lunch and then wandered into the locker room. No one was around, so I left the cell phone in his locker. Of course, Glenn and I were both very careful to leave no signs of our presence. The night before Maria left, I had arranged for Glenn to pick up Maria's car and drive it down to Denver and back. On the stretch of I-70 coming down from the foothills, they have one of those new photo radar detectors. The radar picks up anyone going down the hill more than 10 miles over the limit and snaps a picture of the license plate. It's on trial, and it's not clear whether it was legal or not, but we didn't care. We just wanted to place her car there at an early morning hour. Starting from a few days before Maria left, I was careful to leave no footprints, such as reading my email when I was supposed to be dead. I left my billfold with everything in it in the silver tray in the drawer of my dresser where I always left it. There was a little over $600 in it, about the usual amount. Not wanting to leave my usual mess, I ate out, but no more fast food. I just stopped. I didn't have any coffee, tea, or beer, taking nothing in what I did not consider to be my home anymore. In fact, I cut out hard liquor. I needed to stay sharp and not make any mistakes. I was staying with Glenn and driving back and forth. Hell, I didn't even take a piss in the house. I didn't go to any of my usual hangouts, not my favorite bars or restaurants. I stayed away from anywhere I might run into a friend. All my visits to the house were late at night, and I parked Glenn's car at least a block away. I got a new prescription for my blood pressure and cholesterol medicine from the same guy that drew my blood. I renewed it over the internet in my new name and had them sent to Glenn's address. I didn't go to any local grocery stores or drugstores. I was as close to invisible as possible. I was leaving a lot, a bunch of money, a way of life I enjoyed, and a few friends I would miss. Thankfully, there wasn't much family left. My sister was living in Boston, and I just saw her every other year or so. She would miss me, but with the kids, her husband, and her job, she would be okay. I left about $600,000 in cash or near cash in various checking, savings, and money market accounts. My IRA was probably around $500,000. The house in Evergreen had about $700,000 in equity. Most of all, I left my career as a crime writer. I was good at it. I made tons of money from it. I had 4 novels under contract, 2 of which I had already received advances for. One of those was in the editing process and would be published in a couple of months. I left in my car in the garage, my lovely silver BMW coupe, the M6. It sure looked like I was going to miss my Beamer more than I would Maria. I wish I had kids to leave all this to, but if I had kids, I wouldn't have done it this way. Sure, I would have thrown her sorry self out, but I would have lost this precious revenge. Every day since Glenn and I had started planning this, especially on those nights after we made it, I never made love to her again. After seeing those emails, I pulled my revenge out and caressed it. I petted it. I loved it. It was literally precious to me. Was I vindictive? You bet I was. Finally, it was time for lights out, time to die. Glenn drove me down to Albuquerque, where I gave him a big hug and said goodbye. I caught a bus to El Paso. All my documentation looked used as appropriate. My luggage was even more used. At El Paso, I filled the luggage up with new clothes, totally different brands and styles, down to shoes, socks, and underwear. Then I took a taxi into Juarez. I caught another bus to Mexico City. There I took a plane to Buenos Aires. I stayed there for a week, decompressing and enjoying some excellent food and wine. I got my hair restyled and a more modern look for my eyeglass frames. I then took a different airline to Madrid and on to Lisbon by train. I settled into a nice apartment. I joined a local sports club and started exercising. I really cleaned up my eating habits. As I said, I had cut out fast food cold turkey. I lost 20 lbs in the first 4 months. It didn't take long before both my blood pressure and cholesterol were down, and I could stop taking the pills. As I lost weight, I gradually replaced my clothes with a more European look. I had always looked down on romance novels, but I knew I was going to have to start earning some money. I was fluent in Spanish, so I started reading all the pulp fiction romance stuff in both English and Spanish I could find. I started lining out some story ideas. I wrote a few short stories, and then picked up the manuscript I had brought with me. I reworked it based on my readings, and started looking for a publisher. You know what happened with Maria. I love her very much and totally adore Katrina. I'm picking up Portuguese quicker than I thought I would be able to. Life is good. Oh, and my loving wife, Maria. Would I ever cry over her? No, I don't think so. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.